Hello.
Morning. How are you guys?
All right. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good. So Jesse is a We Robot, which is the conference that he was talking about attending this week. It's live in Boston, so he'll be probably not joining us, but he might try to do a live cameo. Good morning, Morgan.
I'm glad he could make it. You
Yeah,
know, he
yeah,
wasn't sure.
yeah. He said he couldn't make it the other day, and they went to Boston Robotics, which is where they have the big dog robot and some of the other robots that look like mechanical animals walking, trotting. Yeah. So I don't know what they're. I guess he has the two posters. Um, I didn't see any activity in the Slack on that, but I'm sure he worked them out. So I didn't know if he needed any help or not. So any updates?
Um, so reading group's going well.
Okay.
Both of them. We only have two chapters, and hopefully, therefore, only two meetings left of the minor book. Then I'd like to find some like supplementary reading that relates to some of the main ideas from the book, and maybe spend a couple meetings on that. Um, but I'm open. We could pick a different book and just get rid of it. I don't know. With whatever. I liked the not necessarily goal oriented attitude of the reading group. Just get through the book and talk about it and talk about things that relate to it. It doesn't feel like a big thing on the to do list. So I'm excited for it to keep going. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Um, yeah, I would probably vote for maybe unpacking some of the main ideas, unless we have another book that is kind of related to it. It's kind of hard to shift gears and then just forget about everything you just talked about.
Okay. I do we our notes page is very good.
Yeah,
Just what we could collect there, even with it being um I don't know, casual.
I guess my point is that we should do something with, like, when we finish a book, we should do something with it, or reflect on how we could use it. We have human use of human beings. It's human use of notes and ideas. Uh, so you know, I guess it would be nice to bring that maybe back to the Wednesday meetings, or kind of develop something on its own. Something that we can maybe push into the next book, or just kind of work on as a thing, group paper or something like that, based on reflections about what we learned. I think it's a pretty good book. It has a lot of. It's very much a product of its time. It's not. I mean, some of it is very awkward in translating it to the modern day, as you've noticed. Um, and some of it isn't. Some of it's pretty good, pretty prescient. But it's like, some of it is like, if they ever invent the word processor, then we will. But
I liked the phrase at one point, something like automatic machinery of the judgment making type.
oh yeah, I don't know if that'll ever happen. That seems a little bit strange. But
But
yeah,
yeah, some kind of recap, maybe like blog post form would be good.
yeah, that would be good too. All right, yeah. So speaking of blog posts, we have our Medium, and I wanted to go over that. So we've had a couple of things up since the last time we checked in. So the last thing we have that was published, this is from this past week, I think. Naturalization of phenomenalization in nature. Part one: the difficulty of mutual constraints. So this is series Jesse's putting together from the Cognition Futures Reading Group. This is just kind of his thoughts. He's putting things in here. I guess it's going to be a series. So I know Amanda saw this and I saw this. So this is where we have, um, this is related to the methods project. It doesn't have anything about Norbert Weiner in it. I don't think he may have made a mention in passing, but there's a lot of stuff here. It's kind of like there are a lot of loose threads that are kind of hanging out of it. But it just kind of recaps what we've talked about maybe in the last 2 months in those meetings and goes over some of these ideas. Uh, so yeah, he talks about a couple of directions. I would read it over again to see where, if maybe there's something we can, bank a shot off of, or maybe I don't know what part two is going to look like, but it may follow up on some of this. The other thing that was published, Jesse also published a lab update for the first 9 months of 2023. I think we saw this last week, where then it goes through the major themes of the lab, the events that have been attended, and Google Summer of Code involvement, forthcoming projects, a banner update, which are these banners that Jesse's proposed. So it's like Society, Ethics, Tech, DevoWorm, Representational Brains and Phenotypes, which is the agent stuff, Cognition Futures, and Education and Curriculum Development. So those are all kind of updated. I know last year I had done the YouTube videos on the open house, and I still plan to update some of those as well. I think those are useful, but there's nothing. I mean, I could do an update on what we've done in 23. I think Jesse's captured a lot of it, but I could kind of maybe walk through it for people in a video form, so that would be good. And then, if there are things that we want to do again, uh, like project overviews or banner overviews or whatever, that would be a good opportunity to do that. Again, it doesn't have to be that much. It can be like a 5 to 10 minute video describing some thing that you're doing or that you want to do, and we can put it up in the YouTube channel. So it's a good opportunity, I think, to give people a different taste of, because you can write things that are pretty voluminous, but to unpack it and discuss it in length in different parts, that's good. Okay, so now Jesse today is at We Robots, so he doesn't have a link to it in here, but he's at We Robot. He's giving, I guess, the poster presentations, is attending talks. So I look forward next week to hearing about that. And a lot of stuff on like ethics of artificial intelligence and tech policy and law, and there's some, I guess, like human computer interaction stuff or human robot interaction stuff too. So that should be an interesting report. And then I don't know if people saw this one, but Ankit Grover published something on identifying toxic academic workplaces. So he had some pointers here on these things. I don't know if it's from personal experience or not, but uh, he's offered some tips there. So yeah, and then of course I put up like I think last month I put up some recaps of some of the things we've done over the summer. We have one on causality, so the stuff that we did on causality, the different units, those are all summarized here. And then we have another unit on physical intelligence, or physical computing, which is in this section. So we have some good recap of that. We had a number of sessions. I didn't realize that some of the sessions were an hour long. They were within this meeting, but they kind of went on for like an hour. As I was segmenting the YouTube videos, I noticed that some of the sessions were like about an hour, some were about 15 minutes. So they were kind of uneven, but some of them were follow-ups. So that's the way it was structured. So, I think it's nice to, like, if you go through something in a meeting, to kind of pull out the important parts, and especially if it goes over more than one meeting, it's a series of things, to pull it out and just reflect on it and see what you accomplished. Um, yeah, so we have a lot of stuff on that. And this is, I think, is good because I think we can maybe make this into something else as physical computing discussion. I'm not sure if it's actually physical computing or not that we want to maybe write a paper on or give a presentation on, but I think it feeds into some of these ideas. I think there are things that we're doing uh, with respect to, say, physical intelligence or developmental stuff that fit into this quite nicely. So, you how do you develop a physical computer instead of like a digital computer? Um, I don't know, because I mean, it's kind of like I don't know if we can answer the question, how do you develop a digital computer? But, physical computers have links to biology, they have links to other things, and then there's this developmental aspect. So I think this is kind of, something we can follow up on. I'm interested in following up on the causality thread as well. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. It's a little bit harder reach to make. And then this is topics in extended reality. So this is where, we had just the topics that we covered in the meetings. Those were shorter features, but there's a lot to cover, and it's just kind of like walking through some of these issues, topics, and yeah, so that's good. Um, yeah, I just wanted to bring that to people's attention. Okay, so thank you, Amanda, for your update. And did you want to give an update, Morgan? Okay. So next thing I want to. Oh, okay. There you go. All right. So the next thing I wanted to point out was that we have a Discord, and we have. I know Jesse asked me if he could post in the Big Unfinished Ideas Discord, so he has a couple new channels in there. So why don't we go to that? I'll screen share again. And go to the Discord. So this is the principles of bits to matter to mind Discord, and this is for like a lot of virtual stuff, virtual reality, augmented reality, etc. I've been posting in here regularly, uh, and you're getting a lot of different things in different channels. So we have a series of methods channels and some community tools. So the methods channels involve data sets, something we're calling shared interfaces, which are both kind of what Jesse's referring to, and things on like virtual meeting spaces, some tech policy stuff, uh, what they call holo calls, where you bring holograms into a call, um, or things like virtual e-readers or like VR, AR e-readers, things like that. Kind of interesting, some of the innovations that you see around. One of the problems at this area is that there are all these things that kind of pop up. They're almost like at the demo level, and like this thing right here, where you see something, they make something cool, they have a demo, and then there's nothing mentioned of it ever again, or it's just kind of like things that pop up and people don't really have a lot to say about it in terms of how to develop the technology, where it comes from, what it's related to. Maybe it's related to some other technology. So this is sort of these are sort of the building blocks for maybe some of the things we want to do. I know in the open source meetings a while back we talked about building like a uh, science virtual world or like a science metaverse of our own. And so we were sketching out some of the parts of that or some of the components. One of them would be like an e-reader that you would use in that world, and that would be for like papers and things like that. But you can make it more immersive than like say a normal e-reader. So there could also be like interactions with actual physical e-readers and books and things like that. So but to get there, you have to have these building blocks, the technology, and then you can put it together into a larger thing. There's open source knowledge, so there are a number of open source repositories that uh, I've been forking over this summer that other people have created for development. So this is something that is useful if you're doing things with any number of platforms. So I know that Hussein is developing Vision OS stuff. He gave a demo recently. People are working in other types of platforms, uh, working in Unity and so forth. And then there are other things that we're actively forking and trying to build. So that's good. They're all open source tools, so we can modify them according to the license. These are virtual reality experiments. So there's a lot of stuff with the Tilt 5 platform, which is like a augmented reality gaming platform. And you put down a board and you have these glasses and a wand, and the board is there to have objects populating the surface. So you can animate like different types of you can build different types of AR objects on this board and put them there. And it's really meant for gaming. So if you have multiple people with headsets using the same board, they can play a game there. But you can also do a lot of development in AR on it as well. And it's relatively inexpensive to access. So this is why, and it's actually easy to build things on it. So this might be a good thing to check out if you're interested in ed tech. Jesse said he wanted to start doing some more ed tech stuff or other types of. There are a lot of a surprising number of science related applications in there as well. So that's virtual reality experiments. There's the integration of artificial intelligence and virtual reality. So there's a lot of stuff on nerfs that's come out in the recent, maybe in the last month or two, different papers and articles from SIGGRAPH. So, nerfs are these neural radiance fields. So people are using different, they're capturing images and putting them into these sort of, taking the pictures and making moving animations. So you can look at things from different perspectives and things like that. It's kind of it's a photorealistic scene basically. So you can take different viewpoints of the same scene. You can move around in the scene a little bit, but you're not actually capturing the three-dimensional aspect. And it's kind of I think it'd be exciting to start working in terms of putting nerfs either a virtual world or an augmented reality world. There are other types of tools like using large language models and other text tools to build virtual worlds. So, using text commands to build them, or the intersection of these text models to uh, 3D models. So there's a lot of stuff in there. I'm just building these as like kind of libraries of things that we can go back to and look at. So that's why I'm kind of featuring that now so people can see. Then there's this concepts precision channel, which is where we have all these concepts. Some of them are critical, like the death of the metaverse, or the future is a dead mall, which is talking about some of the stuff that people have done in the metaverse that's been abandoned. Uh, there are different things about tracking and foveated rendering and things like that. So they're basically concepts that you can get your hands around and kind of drill down and discuss those concepts and work on them. So that's why I have this channel. And there are different techniques you can use to generate different types of images and effects in these worlds. So there's this Gaussian splat render that just came about recently that was featured. So these are all things that are can be done in different platforms. It's just they're kind of independent of platform, but you can implement them in different worlds. Then there's on something called Presence, which is there's some readings on that. Um, Spatial computing, we've talked about that before. Things about hardware coming out. The Meta Connect event was this past week, so they had this is coming up right now, but yeah, and then virtual topologies, which is a lot of the stuff we've talked about like non-Euclidean worlds and four-dimensional worlds and things like that. And then physical computing, we actually have a little channel on that. So that's, and then of course we have the uh, education and big unfinished ideas channels. So I know Jesse wanted to put some things in here. Jesse's made a channel on neurodivergence, one on philosophy and history of science, which includes actually he's put quite a bit on here. Diverse intelligences, and frontier maps. So these are all projects in incubation. And so, we also have a project management channel, but that's largely for the project management class I've been teaching. So this Discord here, education and big unfinished ideas, is a lot of the stuff we're doing with not only education, different classes that people want to design, but also some of these ideas that are kind of not there yet. So that's a different channel from the Principles of Bits to Matter to Mind. Those are both available to join through the website. There are links to the Discord there. So it looks like Jesse is here. Um, okay, Jesse says I will try to check in more at the top of the hour. And so we have a Notion page for today. Thank you, Jesse. Notes will appear here later. Please take notes from We Robot and include them. More Discord updates too. Check in later. I won't be having audio, but I'll check in periodically in the chat if you want to say anything here. Yeah, Jesse, I hope you're enjoying We Robot. We just mentioned you earlier that you'll be kind of checking in. Yeah, I hope everything is going well at We Robot. Any other comments or questions? So, not much really going on in the Slack. The Slack has, I think last time we went over some of or maybe a couple weeks ago, we went over the brain organoid stuff and maybe some of the cognition future stuff. So, I don't think there's been too much more activity there. A couple weeks ago, we talked about life and energetics. This was something that was sparked some interest. I know Amanda was interested in it. We're talking about energetics as a concept of like kind of energy, energy budgets for organisms or for individuals, and that goes beyond, like, say, cognition. It kind of ties together some of the things we've been talking about, like decision making and evolution and uh, other things like that. So it's kind of an interesting area. Amanda actually posted some papers in, I think it was a Cognition Futures channel. I'm not sure. Um, so the first one actually is interesting. This is from Jeremy England. This is the statistical physics of self-replication. So I actually will talk about Jeremy England in a minute. And then the second paper is on the statistical physics of adaptation. This is also Jeremy England is an author, and he was at the time he was at MIT in the Physics of Living Systems group. Uh, so he has a physics background, but he's also now, I think, in machine learning. Uh, so that's, it's not a huge leap, but it's like you have that sort of physics perspective. And so this is an article from Quantum Magazine. I think it was from 2014, so it's been a while. So this is called the New Physics Theory of Life. So at the time he was at MIT, an MIT physicist has proposed the provocative idea that life exists because the law of increasing entropy drives matter to acquire lifelike physical properties. So this is where you have this increasing entropy, and matter becomes lifelike as a result of it. So this kind of talks about why does life exist. Popular hypotheses credit a primordial soup, a bolt of lightning, and a colossal stroke of luck. They're talking about like the origins of life and something you could replicate in the Miller-Urey experiment, where you take a flask of chemicals and you add an electrical charge or a spark of some type, and you end up with these macromolecules that emerge. And so the idea is that if you have this soup of chemicals, organic chemistry, and you add a spark, which is like electricity, or some sort of energy, that you can get these, you can start the chain of reaction that starts you down the road to life. So this is the idea here. But if a provocative new theory is correct, luck may have little to do with it. Instead, according to the physicist proposing the idea, the origin and subsequent evolution of life follow from the fundamental laws of nature. It should be as unsurprising as rocks rolling downhill. So this has like been a debate whether, early life is unique to the earth or whether those conditions exist in most places, and just, you need of course you need the right conditions, which, on early earth were actually different than the conditions now when life started here. But um they need to be kind of like that life can start up just about anywhere, and whether it's sustained or not is a different question. So that's coming kind of in debate. What they're arguing here is that it's actually quite common. In fact, it should be expected. From the standpoint of physics, there is one essential difference between living things and inanimate clumps of carbon atoms. That is, the former tend to be much better at capturing energy from their environment and dissipating the energy as heat. So living things basically manage their energy budget better than non-living things. So you have this reactor that can store energy, use energy more efficiently, and then dissipate the energy as heat. Um, so Jeremy England from MIT has derived a mathematical formula that he believes explains this capacity. The formula, based on established physics, indicates that when a group of atoms is driven by an external source of energy, like the sun or chemical fuel, it's surrounded by a heat bath, like the ocean or atmosphere. It will often gradually restructure itself in order to dissipate increasingly more energy. This could mean that under certain conditions, matter inexorably acquires the key physical attributes associated with life. So this is an example of a moss, uh, Plagiomnium affine, which is a species of moss, and there are chloroplasts within these cell walls. The cells are hexagonal, so they exist in this tight packing. These so the chloroplasts inside are organelles. They conduct photosynthesis. They capture sunlight from the environment, and then they they use that as energy, and they dissipate the energy. And of course, mosses exist not just alone, but they exist in a food web. So they serve as the base of energy production in the food web. So you have sun that comes, that life exists kind of, I mean, not all life, because there are different types of life in the deep sea that don't really see sunlight, in ocean vents. And of course, they actually have a different basis for their chemicals, or their energetic source, which is chemosynthesis. So they get a lot of energy from the deep ocean vents and some of the chemical reactions down there. But for most life near the surface of the earth, they use sunlight, and then things like mosses or other types of chloroplast uh, uh, having cells are sort of at the bottom of that food web. They're producing energy, and they're dissipating uh, entropy, but they're also dissipating energy upward to consumers of those organisms. And then that gets propagated up the food web. So this is an important basis for life. Um, and energy, of course, it's not a new idea that energy is the basis for life. It's just that we don't exactly know how things began, and we don't know how that all hangs together. So, but this is actually pretty well studied in ecology. So, um, I don't think they mention concepts from ecology in here too much. But in any case, uh, one quote from the article is, "You start with a random clump of atoms, and if you shine light on it for long enough, it should be not so surprising that you get a plant." So that's, I mean, that's, I don't know if that's really true, but uh, I guess the idea is that if you have a random clump of atoms, you put an energy input in, you end up with something that has some sort of, it's a biological organism of some type. I'm not really sure how you get from here to there in that statement, but um, let's see. We had a comment in the chat, perhaps. Okay. All right. Amanda said, I posted them in Bioevolution. Dissipation driven adaptation. And then this is linked to Von Forster's demonic order from noise. Oh, this was a comment, and I remember this now. Related to the question discussed in the RGHUHB channel of why we should see life structure organization as local and temporary islands of decreasing entropy in a world in which the entropy as a whole tends to increase. And that was from Norbert Weiner. That was, but this is something that is a question of, that people have often asked about this, where you get, why do you get these islands of decreasing entropy when in the world as a whole entropy tends to increase? So if we actually look at this, or think about this as go to the Jamboard here. Jamboard, they're retiring Jamboard, by the way, so I'm going to find another solution for this. But so if you have the sun here, that's our main source of energy. We've just mentioned in the reading. And the sun provides energy into, say, like the Earth, or any place where you can host life, I guess. Doesn't really matter. That energy comes into this planet, so the surface of the planet. You have on the surface of the planet, you don't have like an equal chance of hosting life. There are places that are inhospitable, as it were, but also places that are more hospitable. But we'll put that aside for now. Most of the surface of this planet is sort of, a place where energy will land, it'll be consumed, and entropy will increase in the sense that disorder will occur. So this is mostly the physical world where disorder is uh, going up. And then in some places, entropy goes down. What they're saying is that you get these islands where the entropy is going down. So in these places, it's going down, whereas everywhere else, it's going up. And we'll just pretend that there's some islands here where entropy is going down versus up. So what's different about these two things, the islands and the rest of the planet? Well, if we look at the islands, we notice maybe that they're maybe like something like a microbial mat versus like a barren rock planet. Well, we'll just not think about Earth so much right now as it exists today, but maybe very early Earth or another planet where you might have microbial mats that exist, and as opposed to like barren rock. And so these microbial mats will exhibit this decrease in entropy, whereas the barren rock will exhibit an increase in entropy. And so, how does that happen? Well, these I don't really know how that happens, but what happens is you get these colonies of organisms, and the organisms themselves exist as cells, maybe. And there are debates about how cells emerged, the first cells, because life didn't start with cells. Life started with like probably RNA or some macromolecule. And then cells came later as an adaptation. You had first simple cells and then complex cells. So you first had, bacterial cells, and then you had more complex cells with organelles like chloroplasts or with mitochondria. And those came much later. But for now, we're going to talk maybe about a colony of maybe a microbial mat with cells in them. So what are these cells doing? So the cells are acting as sort of a factory for things. It's producing outputs. It's taking in energy. It might be taking in like things like water, if it exists, other chemicals, and it's outputting energy of its own. It's inputting entropy, of course. It's outputting maybe like its own food source for organisms, other animals, other types of things in the like maybe animals or other types of organism in the environment. It really isn't that, so it could be food for another type of organism. But so this is like the sun. This is what would this input be? What did I just say it was? Chemicals, and then water or something like that. So we want to be more specific here in terms of the chemical composition. But anyways, we have food entropy, and then we have other, maybe like interactions with other types of other microbial mats. So sometimes they're survival pressures, so they can't these mats exist independently, but they maybe get crowded out by others mats. Maybe they get crowded out by other organisms in between the mats if they exist, whatever. So those are our three things that we have. These colonies exist there in themselves. They're kind of like molecular machines. They have all sorts of processes going on. There's all sorts of biochemistry in here. It's producing, it's using energy in different ways, but there's this sort of, I guess you could call it an entropy sink. So there is some entropy that gets produced, but there's a lot more energy that gets put out as a result. And so it's a decrease of entropy overall. One reason why we can have this is that these are what we call open systems. Whereas, when we talk about a decrease in entropy, we're usually referring to a closed system. And you're like, why is this an open system, whereas this is a closed system? And the answer is that the open system is, first of all, it continually gets energy from the sun. And so, other things get continual energy from the sun. Although, if you're barren rock, if you take the case of barren rock, the sun beating down on it might heat it up, but that isn't transformed in the same way as it is in the microbial mat. So if you heat up rock with like energy from the sun, it might melt the rock eventually. It might serve as a heat source. It might excite the molecules within the rock, but it doesn't really transform that energy anywhere. In the microbial mat, however, that energy gets transformed. So there's this transformation of energy. And so in ecology, there's this idea of the trophic level. which is where you have energy, say, in a microbial mat, and it can serve as energy for an organism that consumes that microbial mat, and it produces another level of trophic complexity. So you can actually have energy captured here, and you're transforming energy into something that can be consumed by other organisms. Those organisms then can be consumed by other organisms, and so forth. And you can have this trophic web that exists on the planet. You can have a transformation of the surface of the planet itself. You can affect the how sunlight is reflected off the planet. You can affect the nature of the soils. You can affect all sorts of things just from this simple microbial mat as the starting point. So this is what they're talking about with these islands of disorder versus or these islands of decreasing entropy in a sea of increasing entropy. So this is, I mean, just one example from like the origins of life to a living planet where that's the case. Um, if you've ever heard of the Daisy World experiments that James Lovelock produced, this is kind of the principle behind that. He starts off with a planet where it's covered with daisies of different colors, and then those daisies have a certain reflectance. They have a certain sort of starting frequency. So you can have the entire planet covered with daisies, or maybe 50% of it, or you can cover it with different colored daisies at different percentages, and then you can end up with different dynamics coming out of that ecology. And so, it's kind of an interesting sort of extension of this, where those daisy patches are sort of the areas of decreasing entropy, whereas the rest of the planet might have increasing entropy. So that's kind of a quick explanation of it. So when we go back to the new physics of theory of life, this is England's theory is meant to underlie rather than replace Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, which provides a powerful description of life at the level of genes and populations. So he's kind of, trying to do this sort of where he's introducing something new. I'm not really sure if it's new so much. It just builds off of some of the ideas that have been floating around in ecology and maybe in evolution as well. Um, so we're going to talk about the paper. It's sparked controversy amongst his colleagues who see it as either tenuous or a potential breakthrough or both. England has taken a very brave and important step. This is a physics professor. The big hope is that he's identified the underlying physical principle driving the origin and evolution of life. Chemical physicist or biophysicist says that was struck by the originality of his ideas, but at this point they're extremely speculative, especially as applied to life phenomena. So this is another professor of chemistry and chemical biology. So people are not necessarily convinced. Like I said, I think some of this is like, just kind of putting old wine in new bottles, sort of. But the one of the big things is that, he's generated computer simulations. So this is a computer simulation showing a system of particles confined inside of a viscous fluid, in which the turquoise particles here are driven by an oscillating force. So it's these particles that are in this fluid, embedded in the fluid. They're driven by an oscillating force, which is like this energy source over time from top to bottom. So this is the top here, this is the bottom. Um, the force triggers the formation of more bonds among the particles. So as you can see at the top, you have some bonds, but they're sporadic. At the bottom, you see that there's a denser set of bonds between the particles, and that's driven by this oscillating force. You can think of it as energy, not necessarily sunlight, but some sort of energy. And so this is what you get as a result. Okay. Um, so at the heart of England's ideas is the second law of thermodynamics, also known as the law of increasing entropy. or the arrow of time. So the arrow of time is basically the evolution of this system. So we think of the arrow of time as sort of the irreversibility of thermodynamics. So you start off with, early life, and you end up, or you start off with like the beginnings of the universe, maybe. And over time, entropy increases. It could be at any time scale. But basically, entropy is increasing over time. And that's part of the irreversibility of time. If we were to reverse time, we'd also have to reverse entropy. So let's say this is entropy, this is time. So as we go forwards in time, entropy increases by necessity. This could be, throughout the history of the universe. This could be throughout the history of life. It doesn't really matter what the time scale is, as long as we have this increase of entropy over time. Now we have these islands of decreasing entropy over time. So it's not really that they're decreasing, continually. They're kind of like these islands where you get decreasing entropy and increasing entropy. In fact, a lot of open systems do this, where you get this sort of decrease and increase of entropy. It's not this linear scaling like you see here, which would be like a purely physical system, where in a closed system where you have maybe like an ice cube melting or something like that. This is where you have a complex system that's open, that has a lot of parts where energy is being transformed, and so you get this sort of pattern. If you were to go backwards in time, which we haven't been able to do, of course, if you were to time travel backwards, you would also have to reverse entropy. So you'd have to have increasing order as we go back in time, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. You might see a star assemble, for example, where you might see an organism kind of hold together from like being dead, or so. I don't know. It's like you could look at a pumpkin. If you've ever seen a pumpkin rotting on the ground, the pumpkin would like pull together into an organism and then back into a seed, stuff like that. So that's one reason maybe we can't travel back in time. It's almost impossible from an energetic perspective. And so time is, we think about, I think we think about the universe, we think about different dimensions of space. There's really one dimension at a time, and it goes forward. So that's our constraint. Now, this is sort of the idea of the arrow of time. We can't really reverse it in any context as far as we know. Hot things cool down, gases diffuse through air, eggs scramble but never spontaneously unscramble. In short, energy tends to disperse or spread out as time progresses. Well, this is another one where people talk about unscrambling versus scrambling eggs. If you really want to think about like going back in time, you would have to figure out how to unscramble an egg. In other words, take an egg, get the yolk and get the different parts of the egg to come back into phase, and then put it back in the shell. So that's another challenge. Entropy is a measure of this tendency, quantifying how dispersed the energy is among the particles in a system, and how diffuse those particles are through space. It increases as a simple matter of probability. There are more ways for energy to be spread out than it is for it to be concentrated. Thus, as particles in a system move around and interact, they will, through sheer chance, tend to adopt configurations in which the energy is spread out. So this is where you have, over time, the particles as they move around in this sort of Brownian, what we call Brownian motion, where they move around in a sort of a pattern of randomness. Over time, they'll end up spreading out, and they'll end up settling into states that are apart from one another. So if you've ever heard of the term Brownian motion or Brownian noise, it's just where you have these different, particles are just moving around randomly, and then they may settle down into an inert state where they're in a low energy state. A cup of coffee in the room it sits in becomes the same temperature, for example. As long as the cup and the room are left alone, this process is irreversible. So if we have a cup of coffee and it's sitting there, it's a hot cup of coffee, and it sits there in a ceramic mug, mind you. The ceramic mug will act as a conductor for the heat to go out. There's some insulation for a while, but eventually the coffee cup goes cold, and that energy is lost to the room. And so eventually, the energy from the room is lost to the outside as well. But this whole process is irreversible. I mean, you can heat a cup of coffee back up, but you have to put it into the microwave oven. You have to expend more energy heating it, and so forth. So you can't reverse the process of cooling down a cup of coffee unless you actually use energy to heat it up. The coffee never spontaneously heats up again because the odds are overwhelmingly stacked against so much of the room's energy randomly concentrating in its atoms. So that energy diffuses, it doesn't come back and reconcentrate, and that's the law of physics. Although entropy must increase over time in an isolated or closed system. Okay, so then we're talking about closed systems where you don't have a lot of energy exchange. And we talked about, this is a basic kind of experiment where you have limited energy. You put some energy into a room, you close the room, you wait to see how long it takes for the energy to dissipate, and then that's your rate of entropy. Your entropy increases over time, your amount of free energy lowers over time, and it's pretty easy to measure. An open system, by contrast, keeps its entropy low. That is, it divides energy unevenly amongst its atoms by greatly increasing the entropy of its surroundings. In his influential 1944 monograph, What is Life? So, this is a book that Erwin Schrödinger wrote in the 40s to talk about. This is sort of the basis for the field of biophysics. The eminent quantum physicist Erwin Schrödinger argued that this is what living things must do. A plant, for example, absorbs extremely energetic sunlight, uses it to build sugars, and ejects infrared light, a much less concentrated form of energy. The overall entropy of the universe increases during photosynthesis as the sunlight dissipates, even as the plant prevents itself from decaying and maintaining an orderly internal structure. So, this is where the plant is taking in energy from the sun, it's going through photosynthesis, it's able to, as long as it has water, as long as it has other chemical inputs in, say, like soil or some sort of substrate, and it has that energy from the sun, it can renew itself in different ways so it doesn't die. It eventually dies, of course, and then it decays. But it doesn't decay just living. So, sometimes plants decay while they're alive, but, um, it can sometimes regenerate new parts. Sometimes it just maintains itself, uh, like a core part of the plant. So there are a lot of ways that this can happen. And so the living system will be able to resist this sort of uniform decay over time. It can serve to have this perpetuating, um, you know, um, living state perpetuates until something kills the entire organism. So this is where it gets interesting because you have an organism is essentially a bunch of these cells. And we saw the microbial mat example, for example. And the microbial mat, of course, is a set of single cells living in a colony. A plant, however, is a structure. It has different parts. It can invest its energy into those different parts depending on its inputs of water and chemical substrate and sunlight, so it can conserve energy when times are tough. It can expend more energy when times are good, and things like that. So there's a lot of things going on in a say like a plant that you don't see in a microbial mat. There are a lot of structures that exist, different cell types which do different things. So there's this division of labor. So these are all things that play into this as well. So life does not violate the second law of thermodynamics, but until recently, physicists were unable to use thermodynamics to explain why it should arise in the first place. So, yeah, in the 1960s, the physicist Ilya Prigogine made progress on predicting the behavior of open systems weakly driven by external energy sources. So this is this idea of dissipative structures. So the idea that you build structures that sort of uh, transform or buffer energy in some way. You can think of like a river system, or you can think of a plant. Those are examples of this. But the behavior of systems that are far from equilibrium, which are connected to the outside environment, are strongly driven by external sources of energy, and those cannot be predicted very easily. So, Prigogine made progress on this problem, but it's still kind of an unsolved problem. At least up to this point, they're talking about it. The situation changed in the late 90s due to the work of Chris Jarzynski, now at the University of Maryland, and Gavin Crooks, now at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Jarzynski and Crooks showed that entropy produced by a thermodynamic process, such as the cooling of a cup of coffee, corresponds to a simple ratio. The probability that the atoms will undergo that process divided by their probability of undergoing the reverse process, that is spontaneously interacting in such a way that a coffee cup warms up. So this is this ratio where the atoms will undergo a process of entropy divided by their probability of undergoing the reverse process. So as entropy production increases, so does this ratio. So a system's behavior becomes more and more irreversible. Okay, so this is what they're talking about in closed systems. But this is also just generally some sort of any thermodynamic process. So this could be applied to any thermodynamic process, no matter how fast or far from equilibrium. So this is our understanding of far from equilibrium statistical mechanics. These set of experiments greatly improved our understanding of this. And so this was used, of course, by Jeremy England to derive a generalization of the second law of thermodynamics that holds for systems of particles of certain characteristics. So the systems that in question are strongly driven by an external energy source, such as an electromagnetic wave. So this is this experiment that they did with the oscillations. And they can dump heat in a surrounding bath. So the surrounding bath might be like a medium that the particles are embedded in, like the gel that we had in that experiment. This class of systems includes all living things. So this could be any kind of living thing that has this surrounding medium and then this input. England then determined how much such systems tend to evolve over time as they increase their irreversibility. So we can show very simply from the formula that the more likely evolutionary outcomes are going to be the ones that absorbed and dissipated more energy from the environment's external drives on the way to getting there. So this makes intuitive sense. Particles tend to dissipate more energy when they resonate with a driving force or move in the direction that is pushing them. And they are more likely to move in that direction than any other given moment. So this means clumps of atoms surrounded by a bath at some temperature, like the atmosphere or the ocean, should tend over time to arrange themselves to resonate better and better with the sources of mechanical, electromagnetic, or chemical work in their environments. So that's kind of his argument. And then he's talking about, they get into self-replication. So they show self-replicating sphere clusters where, in this experiment here, they coat surfaces of microspheres with a certain coating, and then that can cause these microspheres to spontaneously assemble into a chosen structure. So it makes it more likely for them to self-assemble into these structures. That spontaneous assembly triggers nearby spheres into forming an identical structure. So you can see that you have these sort of structures that are preferred. They coat these individual particles with this coating. It makes them more likely to attract to each other and form these structures. So this is a September paper in the Journal of Chemical Physics. I think. Yeah. So this is okay. So this is a September paper in the Journal of Chemical Physics. Uh, this England reported that the theoretical minimum amount of dissipation that can occur during self-replication of RNA molecules, bacterial cells, uh, there's a theoretical minimal amount of dissipation that can occur there. He also showed that it's very close to the actual amounts these systems dissipate when replicating. In particular, RNA uh, is a particularly cheap building material. Once RNA arose, its Darwinian takeover was perhaps not surprising. So you get up to the RNA level of RNAs in the environment, and then everything else kind of goes as we kind of could predict from Darwinian evolution. Um, the chemistry of the primordial soup, random mutations, geography, catastrophic events, and countless other factors contributed to the fine details of Earth's diverse flora and fauna. But according to England's theory, the underlying principle driving the whole process is dissipation-driven adaptation of matter. So that's what we're talking about. There are a number of papers I cite in here as well. Kind of going through. This is the paper about the microstructures. This is from PNAS by Michael Brenner and colleagues, where they do this experiment with the self-replicating sphere clusters. There's also another experiment in physical review letters where they looked at vortices and turbulent fluids and they spontaneously replicate themselves by drawing energy from shear, which is a type of force in the surrounding fluid. So there are a lot of ways you can get to, uh, energy inputs, a lot of things going on between an isolated system or a seemingly isolated system and its environment, surrounding environment. And there are a lot of things that kind of allow us to think about like self-assembly in the first stirrings of life and the first kind of microbial mats or other types of single cell colonies, and then those in turn move towards like things like trees and other types of organismal structures where we have specialization of cells, specializations of structure, and minimization of entropy and so forth. Okay. So yeah, this von Forrester's demonic order from noise is kind of he talks about demons, and we've talked about demons a lot in the cybernetics reading group and the cognition futures reading group. Sort of this way that they talk about von Forrester talks about it, or actually Norbert Weiner talks about it. And the idea being is that it's something that we don't really know what the mechanism is, but we can say that it doesn't behave like it's supposed to. So it's this demon. And, we can like kind of figure out what the demons are eventually. But it's kind of like one of those fill in the blank categories where we use a term that's maybe not as, it's maybe pre scientific to label something that we don't know what the mechanism is, and then we find out what it is. So Maxwell's demon, for example, is the ability to violate entropy by the sort of spontaneous reorganization of energy and order. And so the demon, of course, is what's the force driving that spontaneous energy. This is a thought experiment, of course. So we don't actually observe this spontaneous reorganization. The idea is, what if we could spontaneously reorganize things? And so that's what they call a demon. But of course, we can figure out what's involved in something similar. So what's involved in building that demon? So if we go back to this life and energetics folder, we do have these two papers. These are the two papers, more scientific papers. This is the Journal of Chemical Physics. So this is statistical physics of self-replication. This paper is just a little over 10 years old now. So um, and so yeah, it kind of talks about what was talked about in the article, but it's a little bit more technical. So this was single-authored paper. The abstract reads: self-replication is a capacity common to every species of living thing. Simple physical intuition dictates Such a process must invariably be fueled by the production of entropy. Here we undertake to make this intuition rigorous and quantitative by deriving a lower bound for the amount of heat that is produced during a process of self-replication in a system coupled with thermal bath. So they have this system that's in a thermal bath, it's providing the energy. We find that the minimum value for the physically allowed rate of heat production is determined by the growth rate, internal entropy, and durability of the replicator. And we discuss the implications of this finding for bacterial cell division, as well as for the prebiotic emergence of self-replicating nucleic acids. So, we're thinking about like the growth rate, which means that you're taking the energy and you're investing it in growth. And then the growth rate is a reflection of that. So it's not necessarily a reflection of energetic input. It's a reflection of how much of that energy can be transformed into growth. So sometimes if your like substrate is not good, then you can't transform enough of your energy into growth. If you're in a really tough medium, for example, like and they put things in gels because they're easy to grow things in, or they put things on a nutrient-rich substrate like cells because you can, it facilitates their growth. Sometimes you're in a very tough substrate, so you can't really grow very fast, given a certain amount of energy. So growth rate is really the transformation of that energy into growth process. Then there's internal entropy, which is this, how much of the energy is not transformed into something useful, into work. And so that internal entropy is, of course, drops out of whatever it is. So this is this entropy term here. And sometimes that's a lot of energy, sometimes that's minimized, but there is always going to be some internal entropy. And then in this case, we have durability of the replicator. In other words, you can grow, you can replicate over time, and you also put energy into replication. So growth is growth maybe in size. Replicator is like reproducing a new individual. So this is, just a very simple system. You have energy as an input. You have a substrate. You have then a growth rate, a replication rate, and then an internal entropy rate. And so they're looking at bacterial cell division and maybe like self-replicating nucleic acids. And so these are, it's a very simple system with simple inputs and outputs. And so we can get a sense of what these things do when we have that kind of a simple model. So it gets through the mathematical formalization here. Let's see what I can pull out. One feature common to all such examples of spontaneous self-replication is their statistical irreversibility. So we talked about thermodynamic irreversibility back here. All right. There's a statistical irreversibility. So this is a more general term for these changes in, like, that we can calculate that those processes aren't reversible. So, for example, clearly, it is much more likely that one bacterium should turn into two than the two should somehow spontaneously revert back into one. So, if we think about cell division, I mean, that's pretty intuitive. You start with one cell, you divide to two cells, and then you think, well, there's a certain amount of energy that gets put into replication. All right, and then you have this mechanism for replication, and so that takes a certain amount of energy. All right, so we can keep replicating our cells, and we keep expending energy, but we have energy coming in, so we actually don't use as much energy as we have coming in, so that's fine. But if we don't have a lot of energy coming in, then we're in trouble because then we can't replicate as fast. So let's say we keep replicating, we have energy coming in. We have to have energy coming in continuously for this, of course. And so as long as that energy required for replication doesn't exceed the energy available, we're okay. Now, suppose we remove our energy source for some reason. And, then what happens? Well, we stop dividing. We can't divide, our cells can't divide anymore. There are some things in biology sometimes called cell fusion where cells will uh, fuse together, but those are kind of messy examples and they're not really something that predominates. So most of the time you see these branching structures. And you see this not only in single cells, but you see this in um, structures like trees and other things in lungs, where you have uh, groups of cells that form branches. There are these general what they call ramifications in like tissues, where you have groups of cells that divide their spatial, uh, you know, like they'll start dividing and they'll form a structure, and that structure will divide itself. So you see a lot of fractal stuff in biology as well. Not surprisingly, because you're conserving this pattern of energy use, this efficient energy use. So, this is kind of the idea that this is kind of linked to the arrow of time, that this unfolds over time, that you can't go backwards and merge these two cells back together. No amount of energy can do that, or at least not that we know of. I mean, maybe it could happen, but it would really work against the arrow of time. So, from the standpoint of physics, this operation contains an intriguing hint of how the properties of self replicators must be constrained by thermodynamic laws, which dictate that irreversibility is always accompanied by an increase in entropy. Um, so, this is, again, tied together. Nevertheless, it has long been considered challenging to speak in universal terms about the statistical physics of living systems because they invariably operate very far from thermodynamic equilibrium and therefore need not obey simple Boltzmann probability distributions over microscopic arrangements. So this is kind of the heart of statistical physics. So when we talk about energy in sort of we could have like a bunch of particles that have structure. And the idea is that over time, those decay into these low energy states. They diffuse and spread out, and they end up in these low energy states. So, a structure, for example, will decay and dissipate into these low energy states, which don't necessarily form any sort of structure in of their own, in and of themselves. Boltzmann entropy is a very simple equation, and it predicts basically. So this is the Boltzmann distribution of our microstates up here, which is this probability in this probability distribution. You draw a probability out, and this is kind of what you get. So the idea, the probability of it decaying, comes from this, and then you end up with this. You end up with this distribution, energetic distribution. So the probability currents connecting I to J to the forward and time reverse directions are equal. So this is from this part here where he's talking about just the dynamics of this thing. So in any case, it's conditional on the Boltzmann probability distribution. So this is basic statistical physics, but it's hard to map that to sort of the way life works. So it kind of goes into macroscopic irreversibility, um, general constraints on self-replication. So the generalization of the second law presented above applies in a wide range of far from equilibrium heat bath coupled scenarios, from the operation of computers to the action of molecular motors. The result turns out to be particularly valuable, however, as a lens through which to take a fresh look at the phenomenon of biological self-replication. Interest in the modeling of evolution long ago gave rise to a rich literature exploring the consequences of self-replication for population dynamics in Darwinian competition. So, in such studies, the idea of Darwinian fitness is frequently evoked in comparisons among different self-replicators in a non-interacting population. Replicators that interact with their environment in order to make copies of themselves fastest are most fit by definition, because successive rounds of exponential growth will ensure that they come to make up an arbitrarily large fraction of the future population. I don't know if it's exponential growth. Well, I guess it's exponential growth in the sense of like bacterial growth, where you have the growth phase and the lag phase and all that. But the idea is that's an interesting idea. So the idea being that, you know, if you're able to use your energy to reproduce, then you can out reproduce everyone else in the population. So, I mean, that's an intriguing idea. Let's take a couple of replicators and look at what that looks like. So, let's say we start with 3 replicators, and this is a very limited idea, but you'll get where I'm going with this. So, we have these 3 replicators, and they all have a different initial fitness, and we'll define the fitness as kind of like, just its ability to reproduce. So it'll start reproducing, it'll make more copies of itself. That's sort of what it's putting its energy into. And for whatever reason, and it's usually a genetic reason, um, these organisms have differential reproductive rates. So if they start dividing, they start making offspring. These offspring are products of the replicator. So this is over some time. And you make more or fewer copies of yourself. So we're making more copies of yourself. So this population has an N of 3 here. Okay. But up here it's like an N of, I don't know what it is, like 23 or something like that. And this replicator is clearly winning because it has a larger fraction of the new population. And so if you keep going, this cell and its descendants will dominate. Now let's think of this as having different colors. So this is blue, this is red. So they're different morphs. This is green. So you'll see that like in this next generation here, the green replicator wins, the red replicator really loses out, and the blue loses out less so. And it's just putting energy into its replication. That's all it's doing. And so it may be that it's better at adhering to the substrate. It may be that it's better at transforming the, say, energy from the sun into energy to reproduce, make copies of itself, whatever. That's why we're doing this. And so you can see that in a Darwinian sense, the green morph is out competing the red or the blue morphs. Okay. So that's what we're getting at here. And, but the thing is that the red and the blue morphs don't disappear. They're just less successful at reproducing. And just by that criteria. Now, if, in the genetics of these single cell organisms, they might evolve some new feature that allows them to pour more energy into their reproduction. So like in cases where you have very simple single cell organisms, this is like basically the only behavior that you have other than moving around. Sometimes there's Brownian motion, sometimes there's directed motion, but most of the time it's putting energy into replication. So that's if you're a complex or more complex organism, you might put energy into other things instead of reproduction. You might put energy into like moving away from predators, so you might survive that way. And so if you reproduce at a lower rate, you still survive because the green morph might be not be motile, and so it might get wiped out by some predator, and that's that. Or you could protect yourself from like a virus That those sorts of things too. But let's just say that it's just energy and replication. So the green morph is out competing the red and the blue morph, and it's because it can put more energy into replication directly. So that's that's why this is kind of linking this sort of idea of energetics into population uh, dynamics. So we had some comments in here. Okay, so Amanda has to go in about 15 minutes. Okay, Jesse said that he won't be able to talk until much later. They're behind schedule. Okay. All right, so let's finish up this and let's go to the other paper. So this is the statistical physics of adaptation. So then this kind of follows from what the first paper was doing. This is a year later. This is with Nikolai Perunov and Robert Marsland. This abstract reads, all living things exhibit adaptations that enable them to survive and reproduce in the natural environment that they inhabit. From a biological standpoint, it has been long understood that this adaptation comes from natural selection, whereby maladapted individuals do not pass their traits effectively to future generations. So this is maladapted individuals not being able to reproduce, adapted individuals being able to pass on their traits. However, we may also consider the phenomenon of adaptation from the standpoint of physics and ask whether it is possible to delineate what the difference is in terms of physical properties between something that is well adapted to its surrounding environment and something that is not. In this work, we undertake to address this question from a theoretical standpoint. So now they're building on these results from far from equilibrium statistical mechanics. They demonstrate a generalization of Helmholtz free energy for the finite time stochastic evolution of driven Newtonian matter. It's kind of what we were talking about before, but these are not going to be like have a genome. They're going to be like just, I guess, basic particle systems. By analyzing this expression term by term, we are able to argue for a general tendency in driven many particle systems toward self-organization into states formed through exceptionally reliable absorption and dissipation of work energy from the surrounding environment. So it's just an accounting of the energy transfer and the energetics. Subsequently, we illustrate the mechanism of this general tendency towards physical adaptation by analyzing the process of random hopping in driven energy landscapes. So this is a very simple example where you're just using energetics. You're just looking at the rate of the replicator, how fast it can replicate. And this is analogous to the catalytic rate of a particular enzyme. We expect the faster grower's progeny, possessing genomes encoding the faster enzymes. They're very simple genomes, not complicated genomes. So they're almost doing like a artificial life experiment here. They expect these faster growing progeny to take over the flask. Meanwhile, at the opposite extreme, common sense tells us that a cow submerged in deep ocean water will not last long enough to calve. So they're just kind of saying that if you don't reproduce very quickly, you don't survive in that population. In both cases, adaptation can be practically defined in the negative by saying that a species that is insufficiently adapted to its environment is one that will not persist there. So that's basically the idea. And then they're looking at fitness as a very uh, very deterministic thing. So they're just looking at one trait or one characteristic that defines all of fitness, and they're just using reproductive or replicator fitness to assess fitness. So of course, fitness has many dimensions in most complex organisms, and it's hard to say what it means to be fit. We observe the outputs or the outcomes of evolution, and we talk about fitness. But at the end of the day, fitness is really about what that organism is experiencing as it's reproducing, as it can reproduce in a single generation. And then you see the outputs as the number of offspring. So it's a it's one of these things where if you do it in a simple experiment like this, it's pretty obvious. But if you move towards more complicated or complex organisms, it's a little bit harder to get your head around what it actually means to have fitness in a certain environment. Um, from the theoretical standpoint of Newtonian physics, whales, algal blooms, and bits of DNA are all just different ways of clumping together the same material building blocks by assigning position and momentum coordinates to each atom. So this is just kind of like really kind of making this a physics problem. And it's kind of boiling down all the different parts of complexity to these position and momentum coordinates for atoms. So you're just looking at single particles, and you're just doing this experiment. Um, Even more intriguingly, we are justified in asking whether it is possible to construct a new notion of how adapted the clumps of matter we observe are to their environment. So, how adapted are they? This is an idea that can be expressed purely in terms of their physical properties without needing to decide in advance on a physical definition of where one replicator ends and another begins. So they start talking about physical adaptation. This is making a clear definition for it, thinking about like all these different systems that are maybe not alive but exhibit these dynamics, or maybe very simple systems that exhibit these dynamics. Um, Now we know that whales and algae are structures that emerged on a planet driven far from thermal equilibrium by the light of the sun. Uh, but we do see intricately organized structures appear in a variety of other far from equilibrium systems. As just one might say, sea creatures that their highly adapted forms clearly reflect various properties of the environment in which they evolved. So too may one say a broad class of hysteretic non-equilibrium systems that, as they evolve stochastically, the structures that emerge in them accumulate information about the external drives of which they have been subject. So this is information that's encoded in this case, the ability to reproduce. This history is encoded in that ability in the sense that it can turn energy into replication, or whether that is not something that it allows. So they're really kind of, boiling a lot of complexity down into a very simple experiment here. But they're basically getting at this idea of far from equilibrium systems and how living systems in particular can uh, basically uh, overcome this problem. So yeah, they go through the equations here. They kind of show this. This is an arbitrary non-equilibrium macro state for the system of interest. It's constructed as the probability density over the microstates where the system is prepared by a controlled procedure to have some macroscopic property I. So the microstates represent some macroscopic property. You look at the probability density in the microstates, and you get a sense of what how it contributes to the macro state. The system externally driven for a period of duration, tau by a time varying field, hcis, while in contact with a thermal bath of inverse temperature beta that absorbs heat. This is the changing Q. Afterwards, one may ask whether the system now has a new macroscopic property 2 instead of 1, so the macroscopic property changes. If so, the new probability distribution over microstates is implicitly given by this term. And so basically you get this change over this transformation between time periods from microstate 1 to microstate 2. The distribution of microstates changes, and maybe it produces a new macrostate, maybe it doesn't. That transformation involves heat absorption and inverse temperature, so it's exposure to that environment. And you can't reverse this easily. So it goes from 1 to 2, basically. So that's that paper. Let's see what we have in the chat here. Okay, so I think that's it for that set of papers. That was, I think, very good. Thank you, Amanda, for bringing those papers up in the Slack. And I think that there's a lot more conversation we can have about that. As I said, we've talked about. I'm trying to do this talk on information and entropy, and that would be useful there too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks for going through those.
Anything you wanted to say, comments, or
I don't think so. I definitely have a better grip on what the papers are getting at after you went through them.
all right? So Jesse is going to tell us a little about We Robot here. So he's live at We Robot as we speak. Some takes from We Robot. The world desperately needs more models of people. Yes, it's I think like people are, and like we just saw in these papers, they treat. There's a tendency to treat to kind of boil down complexity and make assumptions about different types of complexity, and even in psychology they do that a lot with getting subjects from like the Western industrialized world and generalizing to all people, or averaging over people when there's a lot of variation amongst people that we need to sort of make sure we understand. Um, but yeah, that's a good point. IE Workshop points out a lot of needs for the understanding of exploring the inner world of robots as opposed to robots exploring the outer world. That's interesting. So you're talking about the robot's mental life, or are you talking about like their, I guess, what they're doing inside their brain or internal model? Well, I mean, in any case, I guess we'll find out. I wonder how much ChatGPT is distorting a sense of what robots can do or not, especially cognitive, especially in the realm of blame, intention, responsibility, motive, etc. Yeah, I don't know. I think I think ChatGPT is really kind of. Uh, I mean, there was like people were talking about these things before ChatGPT, and now people are using ChatGPT as like the only example. So it's kind of taken over everything, taken over our understanding of this stuff. So yeah, we spent like an hour on those papers. That's good. I think we got a good handle on some of these issues. Maybe we'll do some more things on energetics. I know it was, kind of, well, it was a deep dive. It was kind of, there's so much to say about it. And, that's just like one simple model of life and energetics. Then when you get into more complex organisms with like organ systems and, communities of organisms, and you get into a lot more of the ecological aspects. And there's an ecological flavor to this, but not like explicitly like they've developed in ecology. And I'm curious to know if people have been merging ecology and entropy. That I did run across one paper where they talked about the different ways in which ecologists classify entropy. It was kind of interesting because it's one of those papers where you know you you have a community of people in practice, and they write all these papers on a concept, and they tend to approach it in different ways. And it kind of flies under the radar because when people read the word entropy, they have certain assumptions. They have, people use certain models and things like that. But then when you do the meta analysis, you see that, oh, people are diverging in their understanding of this topic. Like they're diverging in not, sometimes they diverge in their tools, but sometimes they diverge more fundamentally in their concepts. Like what ways are people thinking about entropy in like plant communities versus like physics, or in animal communities, or they're mixed uh, communities or whatever. I mean, they're different schools of thought, and they think about entropy differently. Sometimes they measure it differently. Sometimes they just have different criterion, and it's kind of interesting how that works out. So maybe we'll talk about that next time. It's just interesting from the standpoint of science of it, science of science. Okay, so another thing maybe I'll talk about today. Michael Levin just published a new paper, and he's published a lot of papers on bioelectric networks. And so this paper is from Animal Cognition, and it's very specific to sort of using this concept as something that will look at cognition and allow us to think about mind from this perspective of physiology. So bioelectric networks, of course, exist in all cells, animal cells, Uh, we have neurons that produce action potentials, but we have other cells that produce other electrical potentials. They're not action potentials. They're just summaries of different activity of different ion channels and how that polarizes or depolarizes a cell. And of course, in most cells, they're not trying to produce action potentials. So those ion channel exchanges are more inert, if you want. But they do have signals. They do have specific properties. And so this paper kind of talks about this. It's sort of I guess, a neurocentric approach to this. But suffice it to say, bioelectricity exists in all cell types. And they can form networks. It's just that maybe they're important to physiology of the mind. But let's take a look at the paper and see. So the abstract reads, each of us make the remarkable journey from mere matter to mind. And so this is drawing back on this stuff from energetics from the last section where we talked about how we get um, sort of a living system that defies entropy from inert matter or something like that. And so this is where we're going from matter now to mind. So this is another emergence question, you know. So we start as a quiescent oocyte, which is this small, embryonic state, just chemistry and physics, which is the way we think of oocytes, and slowly, gradually becoming an adult human with complex metacognitive processes, hopes, and dreams. So this is just kind of our adult human selves. In addition, even though we feel ourselves to be a unified single self is capitalized, distinct from the emergent dynamics of termite mounds and other swarms. The reality is that all intelligence is collective intelligence. Each of us consists of a huge number of cells working together to generate a coherent cognitive being with goals, preferences, and memories that belong to the whole and not to its parts. So this is where we're talking about cells working collectively to produce some state or output. And so this again is, termite mounds and other swarms are examples of collective intelligence where the agents have some functional role in the swarm or in the group, and they produce this emergent output that we can observe, but only from like the outside. You can't necessarily observe it from the inside. Uh, yeah, comment. Okay, we'll get back to that. Yeah, so basal cognition is the quest to understand how mind scales, how large numbers of competent subunits can work together to become intelligences that expand the scale of their possible goals. So these are subunits that work together. That's an intelligence that expands what they can do collectively versus what they can do individually. Crucially, the remarkable trick of turning homeostatic cell level physiological competencies into large scale behavioral intelligences. So this is going from, he's saying that if you have a cell, that's a part, and that cell is a physiology, and that cell has certain physiological competencies. So remember we talked about Levin has this work on the tame model, which is where you have these competencies that emerge at different scales of life. So you can have single cells and they can do things like maybe like simple decision making, but you can have groups of cells that do things that are more complex and they have greater competencies as a result. He's talking about cell level homeostatic physiological competencies. So a cell has to maintain homeostasis within itself, has to have physiological functions that it does. Those are its competencies. It doesn't necessarily have the competency of collective decision making or of like mind. So a single cell has certain physiological competencies. But then when you put those cells into some sort of network or into association, and they produce these emergent or these I guess emergent behaviors. That emergent behavior then has a greater degree of competence and a greater number of competencies that translate into large-scale behavioral intelligence. So this sort of turning like individual cell behaviors into these behavioral intelligences is not limited to the electrical dynamics of the brain. So we think about this as a property of neurons, as a property of the brain, but it may not be the only place where this happens. So then he gets into evolution, where evolution was using bioelectric signaling long before neurons and muscles appeared to solve the problem of creating and repairing complex bodies. So this is where you have other systems in like bacterial systems or in other parts of the body. Bioelectric signaling was being used to do things before we had formal nervous systems. Goal-directed things, I guess, is the point here. In this perspective, I review the deep symmetry between the intelligence of developmental morphogenesis, which is, of course, something that he talks about a lot, and that of classical behavior. So he's going to make a parallel between developmental morphogenesis and behavior. So that means, developmental morphogenesis has a goal of creating an embryo that becomes an adult organism, and classical behavior is goal oriented in that it goes from creating these things that you do. So that's the idea. I describe the highly conserved mechanisms that enable the collective intelligence of cells to implement regulative embryogenesis, regeneration, and cancer suppression. So these are higher level organizational features of embryogenesis. You have this regulative ability for cells to, based on their position, based on the sorts of inductive signals that they're exposed to, become certain cell types, become coordinated, and become differentiated in different ways. Then, regeneration is where cells can, they like if you have a wound, if you get cut, it can heal, or you can actually regenerate lost parts of your body. And so, in certain organisms, they have a very high regeneration capacity. They can grow back lost tails, or they can sometimes grow back lost hand or lost paws or digits or things like that. And then cancer suppression, where cancer can be suppressed through bioelectric modulation. I sketched the story of an evolutionary pivot that repurposed the algorithms and cellular machinery that enabled navigation of morphospace into the behavioral navigation of the 3D world, which we so readily recognize as intelligence. So this is something to unpack for sure. So what he's saying here is that their algorithms and cellular machinery just means it's the competencies of cells, that they are doing things in development. They're able to navigate what he calls a morphospace. So a morphospace is what typically people will use to characterize like development and the sort of the cadence of cells going from a single cell to a differentiated organism. So a morphospace might be like a three-dimensional space, or a lot of times it's a higher dimensional space, but it's often reduced to a three-dimensional space simply because it's easier to visualize. But the morphospace it usually has all possible developmental states. So you usually start at the bottom with a single cell. And that single cell can take many trajectories through the morphospace. All right, so it can become like all different types of things. It can become a group of cell colonies. It can become like an embryo that's sort of this mosaic embryo, where the cells are all deterministic in terms of what they're going to become. You can have a regulative embryo where you have these inductive signals that kind of are context dependent, or a lot more context dependent than the mosaic embryo. Or you can just have something that becomes a really large single cell. And the idea being that all these are possibilities in this morphospace. There's different, there are different sort of things that need to happen along these trajectories to make these things happen. Some of these are these competencies of single cells, which are, there are certain competencies that they need to do. They need to survive, as we talked about before. They need to replicate. That's an imperative. There are different things that are going to happen along different trajectories. So in this case, growth was actually the imperative instead of replication. In this case, replication might be the imperative instead of building structures. And in this case, you might have an imperative of reaching its adult state. So you have some proliferation, but not too much. You need cells that can behave in sort of an adult state stably. And in this case, maybe you don't want to have a clear, like, deterministic outcome. It depends on the signals that the cells are exposed to. So these are all competencies that have different sort of, depending on the context of whatever this embryo becomes, or this developmental trajectory, wherever it ends, then those are the competencies that are stressed and developed. But those are the competencies of single cells. Now we want to know what the competencies of the collective are. All right. And that is like not something that you need to evaluate at the end. That can be something that you can evaluate along this trajectory. And as the cells are forming these collective structures, you can ask what competencies are they gained from a single cell. So from a single cell perspective to the collective perspective, what is it gained? So this is a morphospace. Like I said, it's this space, and it can be very highly multidimensional. Usually it's thought of in this three-dimensional form, and it's basically just all these trajectories, so different trajectories of cells. And then evaluating those trajectories with respect to its competencies. And I will, then we'll move on to the second part of the statement. So we're at this part where we talk about navigating the morphospace, and then we need to think about behavioral navigation in the 3D world, which we so readily recognize as intelligence. So now we take this morphospace and we say, well, that's just kind of like, a theoretical thing. It's a theoretical construct. What happens though when we actually have a three-dimensional world? Okay. So I'm not trying to map one to the other, although it would be kind of an interesting experiment. But this is just a different 3D world. And I don't necessarily know if intelligence is inherently three-dimensional. All right, so I imagine if you talk to a machine learning person, they'll say intelligence is high dimensional. We boil it down to a three-dimensional representation. Well, it's intelligent behavior. And then, of course, the computational neuroscientists will talk about manifolds and things like that. But this is like your three-dimensional world of intelligent behavior. The agent is here. And then the agent has to navigate this three-dimensional world of behavior using different trajectories. So these trajectories move through the environment. Things are located in 3 dimensions. They move in 3 dimensions. They move up and down over time. So there's this sort of this navigation component. Okay. So single cells navigate, collectively cells navigate, organisms navigate. There are different ways that they navigate. So single cells tend to be like responsive to taxis, or these different movements towards chemicals or light. whereas your more complex organisms tend to have maybe goal-oriented behaviors. So it requires navigation, it requires planning. All right, so there's a time component here, usually in planning. Navigation, it's usually space, although that could also be time because you plan to go somewhere. If you want to plan a trip out to the other side of the continent, you have to find your path to that place, but you also have to plan for it. So actually, it's I guess, a four-dimensional world because you have 3 dimensions of space plus time. So, this is what we're talking about with respect to intelligent behavior. It's goal oriented. It's projected into space and projected into time by default. So this is what we were talking about before. And of course, the arrow of time still applies here because we can't we can't run intelligent behavior backwards, as it were. So we can't plan to do something in the past or change the past in any way. And there are no explicit physical laws preventing that, but it's an interesting concept. So what do we have in the chat? Oh yeah. So I'll need to put those into the our file. So let me do that later. I'll do that after the meeting. I'll put each one in. All right. So back to the paper. Understanding the bioelectric dynamics that underlie construction of complex bodies and brains. So again, the bodies are the sort of the developmental morphogenesis in the morphospace. The brains are the behavior, the classical behavior, the bioelectric dynamics in this 3D world that unfold in the 3D world. They provide an essential path to understanding the natural evolution and bioengineered design of diverse intelligences within and beyond the phylogenetic history of Earth. So we get into this idea of diverse intelligences, which is, of course, you have intelligent behavior. It can happen in many different ways. We have to have a unified model of it, though, to do that. So all animals with advanced conventional cognitive capacities are the products of a very lengthy evolutionary process of accumulating gradual modifications of early microbial life. So again, we start very simply and we move out through gradually modifying things. Even more remarkably, each of us personally took a journey of which matter acquired mind. So we start life as a quiescent oocyte and slowly remodel into an adult modern human with metacognitive self-aware capacities and the ability to reason about entire counterfactual universes. So we get this, this three-dimensional space. It's got these goal-oriented points. There's goal-directedness. There's metacognition going on. This is unfolding in time. But along with the sort of the intelligent behavior, we have sort of a developing morphology that's producing goal-oriented behaviors. So, for example, if you start with an oocyte and you move out in this morphospace, each one of these hash marks here is a different set of paths through this goal-oriented space. So the goal-oriented space is different, much different, for an earlier form than a later form. So if you're like early in development along one of these morphospace paths, your set of goals is very different than if you're at a later stage. And so the goals are different. So the goals for a very early stage development might be to, be able to interact with your neighboring cells or maintain homeostasis in your cell or, migrate somewhere very simply based on a simple light stimulus. Your goal-oriented behavior later is going to be much more complex. It's going to involve metacognition. It might involve getting energy, but it might also involve, you know, other types of cognition, metacognition. So this is how this 3D world of intelligent behavior would change with the changes in developmental state. Oh yeah. Come on, we just jump back in time, and I might check in a bit here. Okay. So this is kind of goes through this. Um, how did the information processing capabilities of a single cell, and there's some citations here, with metabolic and physical competencies, inflate to that of a human who can pursue goals of planetary scale whose endpoint may be far after their expected lifespan? So, taking evolution and especially developmental biology seriously means coming to grips with the continuous process of transformation that enables configurations of matter to express increasingly greater degrees and kinds of cognitive capabilities. So these are decision making, generalization, perception, causality detection, innate responses, learning, and advanced problem solving. So these taken together as like these things that come from cells that move into the world of like metacognition or whatever, is part of this emerging field of basal cognition. And so this is the Belisca and Levin reference and some of Levin's work and Lyon's work. This strives to understand the evolutionary and embryological origins of our current behavioral capacities and uncover the physical and computational dynamics by which simple minds emerge from chemistry and scale over time. So this is an example here, I guess. This is a nice figure. Cognitive scaling, rat learning to press a lever to get reward, illustrates the principle of cognitive scaling. The rat is a collective of cells, some of which interact with the lever, the skin of the paws, and some of which get the nutrient reward intestinal cells. However, no single cell has both experiences, and it's the causal structure of the tissue network that enables credit assignment to behaviors. So this is nice. This is the rat, and it's pulling a lever, and the brain is telling it to pull the lever to get a reward. But the paws are the cells that are doing that, pulling the lever, and the mouth is getting the reward, so the reward is distributed to the rest of the cells. The paws are just along for the ride, but it's actually doing the deed and it's pulling the lever. And so this is how these networks are cooperating. If you thought about this in terms of a network of like a bacterial collective, it'd be one part of the bacterial collective navigating the environment, helping to move the other cells along. And then some cells are ingesting some nutrients and then diffusing some of that energy to other cells. It's a similar concept, although in the rat, so I mean, that's one way you can think about this. And credit assignment is just simply, of course, the term du jour of machine learning, where they say, well, or of computational neuroscience as well, where, what cells are responsible for what behaviors or what actions. And so maybe that's not the best way to look at this, but I think it's an interesting take. Then in the rest of this figure, they kind of talk about this is sort of our arrow of time, but like oriented in a weird way here. So this is basically how cognition deals with this arrow of time. So the flux of energy goes from the past to the future, right? Everything is flowing from the past to the future in terms of causality as well, because we can have retrocausal things, but they typically aren't. Um, you know, the biology of say development is not retrocausal, and certainly the energetics of the organism are not retrocausal. But as humans, we can think about retrocausality. We can think about the past, we can think about the future, and we can sometimes even confuse the future with the past in terms of causality. And you can see that this is the here now, this is the future, this is the past, this is time and space, and then the space is like there's time that's going up and down, space going laterally, And of course, laterally, you have these concentric circles that are moving out from body to microenvironment to territory to planet. So you're an agent, you're sitting here and now, you're in a body as a cell, maybe. You're in a microenvironment, which maybe this is microenvironments within bodies as well, but I think what they mean by microenvironment is the environment of the body versus the territory and then the planet. So in any case, you can break this down any way you want, but the idea is that you have an agent. It sits within a community of agents within a microenvironment, and that may be within a body, that may be within a territory like a microbial mat, or that might be the microenvironment. The territory might be a region of space with interactions, and then a planet. And we saw that back in the first slide here where we have the planet with microbial mats, we have open rock, we have the sun coming down, and that, that region might be like the interaction between the microbial mat and the rock substrate. And then that's, there's a different territory here, and then those, their interactions between those, they're all taking in energy from a common source. And then eventually maybe they grow together. And maybe those microbial mats form a superorganism at some point because they become interdependent. And so one of the things about early life is this idea that animal cells are actually, the products of they're almost like superorganisms of organelles. So that you had microbial cells that started to ingest different organelles. And then these are actually just eukaryotic cells, not just animal cells, plant cells as well. And those organelles are being digested, and they form this new cell type with a bunch of organelles inside, much more complex than prokaryotic cells. And then that's a different mode of life, right? So according to Levin, that's a different, sort of set of competencies that emerge. So, D is the isolated individual's range of perception. So this is a single cell where maybe it anticipates the future, it remembers the past, it uses the past to predict the future. It may use the future to think about the past, or its anticipation to recall memory, and then there's individual spatial perception. So it has to perceive the space around it. And it puts it into this time scale, or this temporal flow. And then, of course, you have a group of cells where it's not just one cell, but it's a group of cells where it's integrating its spatial perception. It's expanding its memory to different trajectories of history. And its anticipation is greater. Its awareness maybe of the future is greater. Its anticipation is more refined. And then finally, this F, which is a homeostatic loop where you measure the current state, you compare it to a set point, and then if there's an error, then you act. If not, then you don't act. And so this is, again, something that scales up to different homeostatic controllers where you're comparing each cell might have a different homeostatic set point, or it might have a different state locally. So the set point changes with respect to that state, and you get a lot of interesting dynamics that way. In a collective of cells, it's much different than a single cell in terms of maintaining homeostasis. So there's a lot more complicated control that needs to happen. So you might evolve a complicated controller to make that happen. Okay, so that's, and there are a lot of really nice, he does a lot of really nice figures. He really kind of gets into this tiers of biological cognition, from a gene regulatory network to a cytoskeleton to a neural network to whole tissues and organs to a whole organism and then to a group. So here's his flatworm. That's, I think, what he was originally working on. This is flatworm, and this is an organism that can regenerate itself from a single cell. So it can have like this, maybe this, and the argument is that that single cell can generate a bioelectric field on which regeneration can occur and reconstruct the entire organism. Now that's a specific type of organism. So, that's not true of all organisms. That's just the flatworm model. But that's sort of the one of the competencies of cells and collections of cells in that species. So these competencies aren't just like don't necessarily scale just with complexity. They could be very specific to certain organisms. So, for example, like uh, social insects. Social insects can have a very good. Uh, they're very good at creating collective behaviors and operating in collectives. But there's some solitary insects that don't do that. And so you can't expect them to build these collectives as well. So that competency is not there in certain insects, but there in others. So there's a lot more going on here than, just simply scaling things up. So yeah, he's really done a really good job of like drawing figures. This is like I guess almost like a landscape model of behavioral, morphospace, transcriptional, physiological, and metabolic paths that are involved in a single individual as it's scaling up from the molecule to the biosphere. So it's this sort of vertical organization. You end up with these different paths in different, from different perspectives. So metabolic trajectories are different from physiological trajectories, but it's basically the same cell or organism, and it's got the same competencies. So he refers to it as a nesting doll, but it's not really true. It's more complicated than that. So, anyways, that's the Levin paper. I think it fits quite well within our discussion of uh, energetics. Okay, so Jesse has put a number of things in the chat. Let's go through those.
Can you hear me, or is it back?
Yes. Oh, I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's great. Yeah, I'm just checking in. I guess we go on camera just a bit, but like it's we just caught up. Like it's half like intermission right now.
Okay.
Cool. We're like a half an hour behind, and then it just went back to normal. So I didn't think I'd even be able to stop it at all. Um, no, it's about the paper. The whole everything from that was 11 paper.
Yeah, the Levin paper. That the second part was the Levin paper. All those figures are from the Levin paper. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I like that. Like I wanted to look into it more because I feel like there's a lot of like the multi-scale stuff is really relevant. So that's basically what I was saying in the chat there.
Okay.
But hi, sorry.
It's fine.
Um,
Yeah. What's been going on there?
it's good. It's a little different than it was last year, uh, but also the same the setup, the same discussion, the same way papers to discuss and stuff like that. I didn't get to do pretty much anything yesterday. I didn't get to do post position making to a workshop, which I'm really disappointed in. I just to handle some stuff on the service and forms, so it's tough. But discussion's good. I'm trying to review some of the things I put in the chat a bunch earlier. I know that was all out of context for stuff. Let's see here. Also, but before I do that, I don't want to interrupt any discussion about the other things.
Oh no, I think we're all done with that. I just wanted to see what you had going on there. I wanted to get a live update, I guess.
Yeah, live update. It's very. I'm a big fan of like the We Robot community. And, it's similar vibe from last year. I think the workshop. I'm really um, disappointed that I couldn't go to the workshop, especially because I think it was a lot of fun and I got to see lots of dynamic stuff. I had a nice dinner afterwards too. So all the things I didn't get to do, but it was sort of the. I can't really read it very well, but just some of your headlines have been actually, it might be best if I actually just show screen. We can bring our lens back here. Right, yes. It's fine. I don't know if
Oh yeah, I can see
too
your
much
screen.
noise or not. Oh, really?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see your screen.
Here, I'm actually really curious about this. I mean, like, um, but this one looks really cool. I might not be able to stay for this one, but this detecting illegal imaginaries, which is the last paper today. We really noticed about like frontier maps
Yeah.
and sort of trajectory sorts of things. So that's really good. Here's the overall agenda. Um, Pre-conference, design justice. A lot of fun things are there. I'm familiar with Kate and Darling from last year and as much as I did and everything else too. That's like such a stuff here. So where's the okay? So Friday, taking scale seriously in robotics and AI law. I think that's I really would have liked to be here for that one, but it looked. Just do this. No, it's gonna let me do it like this. This looks really interesting. I think it's a major topic that I think fits with a lot of the scaling issues we talk about in different ways, and so that is being taken in a legal context, which is pretty cool. But just to kind of keep it moving here, potential research and development that also be quite relevant for us. Social digital vulnerability, which is Ryan Cowell. I like a lot of his work. He was the host last year at Washington. I don't really know what that is entirely, but first check it out. Dual session on safety yesterday. Fiduciary law poster session. This morning, which is where I was here, police robots. That's really interesting. A lot of questions about this. I put this one in the Notion a little bit up here. I took a few notes. I'll put more in later. There's a preview of what it looked like earlier today, like at the start of today. And then you have, you know, yeah, we just had a discussion about the AI. That's coming up next. We had a discussion about legal aspects of development. So it's based off a surgeon, like robot surgery, but it kind of looked into some other questions too about where's the liability and what can happen. So yeah, then there's the AI. And it's a really cool looking technical legal imaginaries and so that's kind of what's on the docket. And I guess my 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 thoughts that I kind of talked about in the chat, I'll just recap here really briefly, are I really think about the EI workshop. I feel like the EI conference, the Body Intelligence Conference that we've been at for a long time, I feel like that's the EI conference doesn't, I don't think has any, I never see anything about like the legal components there, but I feel like it's super relevant and super, the work in that space will inform the We Robot space, the legal space so much, because so much of the questions are like, well, we don't really know how this, or where's the certain, like, always questions about like the internal world, internal states, or what can robots perceive or do. And it's just like, yeah, like kind of, it's like trying to hold space for this discussion about, well, we don't really know what capacity of the robots are. Robots being like AI and other things here. So you have to like kind of talk about that in the different frameworks and sort of the here's legal precedents, here's what we can do, here's what we can understand, here's what we can measure. But we're kind of dancing around sort of the black box, but more so than that too. So um, it's been cool that way. But just like so much more work on also like it too. This is like put it, phenomenological-ish stuff. The space there is so we don't have, there's a glaring absence of talking about those models because they don't really exist. I feel like I want to continue to figure out how to articulate that there's uh, not even that they can exist, but like there's certain things that just don't exist in the space that are being talked around with link the physical hardware computational other side of the coin of like what are we, because there's this sort of like totally vague responsibility, motivation, intention, uploading procedures, uploading professional, you know, practices, and it's like, well, the, the, the limitation of what is on like the messy internal cognitive side of things is there. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but it's just like you're not going to be able to address that, so you're going to just dance around it continuously. What else can I say here?
That was the uploading professional standards comment in the chat, right?
Yeah, and I mean it was just like discussion. It was used as a sense of it was intentional. We're going to skip to the future and talk about when this could happen. But I feel like so much of, because I'm familiar with like the space and what isn't in the space. There's sort of this, I don't know. I guess the easiest way to say it is what I said before, like embodied intelligence workshop and the We Robot workshop. I would love to put them together. Actually, like this is sort of the missing link here because it's not, at least as far as like tracking going forward in a more immediate way. The sort of it's this tough space between what is available and then trying to legislate or develop policies that account for that the rush of development. It's like you do have to think about where it can go. We really just there's such a little ability to tie specific cognitive structuring or the things like motivation and blame and like sort of like in this big AI black box about some things. And I think this ties in a lot of the work which we talked. I did more with them last year, but the like AI safety group or whatever, but like the focus on interpretability and explainability and just the work there, putting that in the context of also like the cognitive internal whatever work. I don't really know what to call that. The inner world. People, just the robot too. If we don't, people models are inadequate. You can have sort of a computationally simple model of it, like hardware and software is doing. But even in that non-human version of it, like interpretability and explainability, it's tough, really, really, really challenging work. And like, right, it's really challenging work there. So I feel like I'd love to, if I could just like my own modern day Macy's conference about this topic, I would have applied intelligence we robot and uh, maybe some stuff from explainability community too, like just the hardcore, like people who are really focused on that specific task. I feel like that would be the very pot to emerge from. Of course, other frontier map stuff too, but like that'd be fun. But yeah, that's it. I have to get my way through. Anything else I can everything like comment on from the event, or I might have a few questions about things earlier today too, but I don't want to keep you if you have to go.
Okay. Well, we can talk about those more in the Slack. I'm just curious though, what's going on with the posters? Are you all set for that?
That was yesterday, so there's no. I didn't get to go to that.
No.
I may try to show something later, but it was a not that happened. On the plot Trisha side of things too, it's kind of plot is kind of still on hiatus of sorts, so that was a bit of a factor in things too. But Frontier Map, I may show something later, but there's no the whole thing is not really there. So uh, I did miss like 2/3 of the event, which is really not ideal, but it's what it is.
Well, that's too bad. Anyways, all right. Well, yeah. Let's. I know you're going to probably put up a blog post on this at some point. We Robot 2023, or
I'd like to. It would be quite small. I feel like I didn't. I actually want to. I really do want to reach out to a couple of authors and other folks. So I'm gonna have to go. I might not have a lot of time here today too, but there's a few things that I want to follow up on. So
you could also do a post on like kind of the reflection. So you mentioned EI, like your kind of your dream team of influences, so like EI workshop, We
yeah,
Robot, all these other things. That might be a good way to kind of summarize this too.
yeah. Um, I will do that. Last thing, you had one 11 paper. Or did you have a whole was it like a whole discussion series about like multi-scale stuff? Or what was
It was like sort of like life and energetics was like the one
okay?
feature, and then there was 11 paper. I'll put some updates in the Notion. So
Okay, thank you.
right.
But yeah, good to check in, and I'll see you all next time.
Well, yeah. Thanks for the live update, and thanks for everyone for attending. We'll continue some of the conversations in Slack, and otherwise, see you next week. Thank you.